Well, thank you so much, Lauren, Lynn, and Christina for organizing this great series, and Julie, of course, in our section leadership. Let me go ahead and share the PowerPoint. Somebody just unmute and yell at me if it looks goofy or anything. So yeah, we're really pleased to be here, and I really like this format that gets to feature lab members. So I'm really excited to see all the future groups that are highlighted in this series. So we're going to be talking about adapting agriculture to climate change, and I just wanted to start by emphasizing that when we think about climate change, agriculture is really front and center for a couple of reasons. One is that it makes up a massive amount of emissions, right? So it plays a really important role for mitigation. Agricultural production and associated land use change make up about 1/4 of global emissions. And then if we zoom out just a little bit to think about basically the entire food system, transportation, processing, trade, those sorts of things, we get up to about 1/3 of global emissions. So it's really substantial. And at the same time, it's such a big contributor to climate change. Food production is one of the most profound ways that we could be affected by climate change as well, and are being affected by climate change. Whether it's direct impacts on crops and livestock, or changes in snowpack and water supplies for irrigation. So our community, the global environmental change community, has made huge progress in improving our estimation of climate change impacts on agriculture. I just put up a smattering of impressive papers here from various colleagues. And some of the topics that have been explored include things like, how does crop development or duration change with climate change, different pathways of stress on crops, whether that's direct heat stress or changes in water stress, interactions with pests and diseases, changes in water use efficiency or water supplies for irrigation. So a whole host of really complicated pathways that are all important, manifesting in how climate change is impacting agriculture. But at the same time, we still have a ways to go, because there are a lot of key uncertainties in how we go about our science on this topic. And in particular, when we think into the future and try and project the impacts of future climate change, we often do things like keeping the crop area distributions fixed into the future, the types of cultivars that we might be simulating in the models stay the same, as well as when crops are planted and harvested, and the types of management that those crops are receiving. But if we know anything about the history of agriculture, it's that agriculture is just changing all the time, right? So it really begs the question of, how can we adapt to climate change, and how much can we adapt? In this emerging field of climate adaptation and agriculture requires not just forward-looking scenario analyses, which is what we might immediately go to, but also exploring the past, looking for retrospective evidence of adaptation, and looking at farmers have adapted to the climate change we've seen so far, as well as social science and participatory community-based research projects to actually facilitate adaptation on the ground. So the IPCC defines adaptation as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. So usually we're thinking about ways that we can moderate or avoid harm. But if you're a farmer in Alaska and you're super jazzed about climate change, you could be thinking about adapting your system for a warmer climate, which might enable you to do more things or have a higher production. But there's another way we can think about adaptation, and that's in this context of risk, which we often see in a lot of climate assessments. So here we're conceptualizing the risk of a damaging climate change impact as the intersection of the physical climate hazard itself. So something like a drought or a heat wave or a flood event, the exposure, so just geographically, are you in the path of that hazard? And the vulnerability, so basically your sensitivity to that hazard. If we think about this in the context of human health and a heat wave, the heat wave is a hazard, the exposure is, do you live in the path of the heat wave or do you live 500 miles away? Your vulnerability would be determined by whether you work an office job or you are an outdoor laborer. Do you have air conditioning in your home or not? Those sorts of things. The physical climate hazards are, of course, determined by climate variability and change, but vulnerability and exposure are determined by a range of factors, both social and environmental and economic. And because of that, it provides an opportunity to change those axes and change, and there in doing so, alter our risk. So one opportunity is, of course, try and decrease your vulnerability to the hazard. We're calling this in situ adaptations. So basically things that would reduce the sensitivity to the hazard. Things like if you're growing crops, you might find that changing your planting times or shifting your cultivars could help. If you have livestock, something like housing, shading, fans, those sorts of things could alter the sensitivity of any given system, say maize or your dairy herd to a given hazard. Another opportunity is through changing exposure. Basically, as farmers make individual choices about what crops to grow and what livestock to have on their farm, they are changing the way that they are exposed to climate hazards. And as individual farmers make these choices about what to grow, what sort of crop rotations to have, whether they want to try and diversify their farm, that can actually manifest in large scale changes in cropping or cropping system or livestock system geography. And those large scale changes may in and of themselves be adaptive if they help the system as a whole avoid exposure to rising hazards. And then there's a third category that we've outlined here, which is changes in infrastructure and support systems for agriculture, stuff like irrigation infrastructure, water management, or investments in breeding that maybe take a long time to pay off, but nevertheless, these are long-term contributions to reducing vulnerability or allowing us to have a more optimal geography. All right, so I'm gonna just talk about a couple of examples from our lab group that I think highlight the changes in vulnerability and exposure really well. These were a couple of papers led by former lab members who couldn't be here today, but the first is looking at adaptation in dairy systems. This was led by Maria Gilbert Corral and came out this past year in Nature Food. So we were interested in looking at dairy systems, even though we are used to looking at crops, but we found it a really interesting topic because the animal level responses are pretty well described by animal scientists. So people know how cows respond to heat and humidity and cold, but the system level responses were relatively unknown. And what do I mean by that? So a cow, there are a lot of factors that can mediate the weather pattern, the exposure to those weather patterns, things like housing, shading, fans, misters. These are all things that could alter the sensitivity of cows to weather patterns in a given location, right? So what we did is we took monthly milk yields that are at the state level across the US. We have a big time series from the USDA, and we analyzed the relationship between those milk yields and temperature and humidity. And we use this temperature and humidity index that's basically like a heat stress index for it's like the heat index that we think of, when we look at our weather apps. It's like that, but for cows, right? It's like how are they experiencing these different levels of temperature and humidity in terms of their ability to, say, cool off. Even though our milk yields are at the state level, we know where the cows are located within each state, so we can basically link up the weather exposure to those milk yields. And the green bars in this graph show the exposure to different bins of THI. And then the blue line shows the marginal response of experiencing a day at a given level of THI relative to this kind of set of optimal conditions around 70 THI. And so you can see really clearly both cold stress came out and heat stress. And it was a little surprising to us that the cold stress was actually, there was more total exposure to cold stress days than heat stress days. But what was really interesting is when we started breaking this data set apart and looking at differences by average climate and over time. So on the left here, you'll note that the cold states are less sensitive to cold and a bit more sensitive to heat, indicating kind of local adaptation to their climatology, their local system. But if we look over time, more recent years are much less sensitive overall compared to how they were in the first 20 years of the record, indicating that farmers are undertaking management practices that are reducing their vulnerability or their sensitivity to weather conditions of any kind, both heat and cold. And when we put this all together, we found that the impact of climate change itself was actually very small because those increases in heat stress were kind of counterbalanced by decreases in cold stress. But what was really powerful was this decrease in sensitivity overall to either heat or cold. And so there was a positive yield effect nationally from that change. The second example I want to give was led by Lindsay Sloat and came out in 2020 in Nature Communications. And this was looking at changes in exposure. And what we did is we collaborated with our colleagues at the University of Minnesota, who put together kind of the latest and greatest global crop census and survey data. We also used irrigation data, and we were able to track changes in rain-fed harvest area, basically look at crop migration since 1973. And we're looking here, we're focusing on rain-fed crops because they're the most sensitive to high temperatures. And you can see some really interesting patterns, like for maize in the US, kind of a shift up towards the northern Great Plains, or wheat in Europe, moving more to the north from the south. And what we did, knowing that rain-fed crops are very sensitive to high temperatures, we looked at how the trends in temperature exposure differed in reality as crops moved across the globe versus a counterfactual scenario where crops would have stayed static in their locations kind of circa the mid-70s. And this next slide shows the temperature trends that would have occurred if crops stayed static in the dashed gray lines versus those that were experienced in the red. And so you can see that the shifts in crop distributions, in this case for maize, did reduce the trend in very high temperatures that maize was exposed to globally. And so we can call this significant evidence for adaptation by migration for rain-fed maize. So not to say that there aren't harms being experienced by the farmers who are, of course, choosing not to grow rain-fed maize anymore, but as a whole, the system is now experiencing a little bit less of that warming than it would have in the absence of migration. All right. So with that, that's enough for me. And I'm going to pass it over to Kyung, who's going to be talking about sensitivity and exposure to hydrologic hazards for major US crops. Oh, sorry. I was going to introduce here everybody's talk first. So I'll do that before Kyung takes the helm. After Kyung, we have Eva, who's going to be talking about historical changes in snowmelt for irrigation. and then Lena, who's going to be talking about pathways of wildfire impact on agriculture. So these are all kind of thinking more about the hazard side of this diagram in different ways. More for rain-fed crops, irrigated crops, and then kind of as underappreciated risk of wildfire. And then Avery will be talking about how, as we try and adapt to these changes, perhaps through changes in irrigation, that could possibly incur some feedbacks with climate change. So with that, I'll pass it to Kim.
Thanks, Nathan, for the great summary and intro. So my research is about the hydrologic stress on crop yields, which is the hazard assessment and the risk framework that Nathan just mentioned. So the availability of water to plants is controlled by hydrologic balance between atmospheric water demand and the land water supply. The figure here shows the conceptual yield responses to different hydrologic conditions. And unlike the hydrologic balances, the hydrologic imbalances in the top left and the bottom right quadrants, where water demand and supply do not meet, provide the negative yield responses. And there has been great understanding and quantifying hydrologic stress on crop yields, but there's still mixed understanding about it due to different definitions of a drought and waterloggings by different fields, and limited long-term observation soil moisture data, and tight hydrologic couplings between the atmosphere and land. And in terms of methodologies, there's still large uncertainty in using process-based models to quantify hydrologic stress on crop yields, because unlike statistical regression models, the process-based models should be parameterized with right logics and observation data, although it has the advantage of explaining in physiological mechanism. So we use the statistical regression model to estimate the average yields of rain-fed maize and soybeans as a function of the exposure metrics between vapor pressure deficit from observation data and the root zone soil moisture, which are the model outputs, but assimilated with satellite data. And beta here indicate the coefficients of the model as exposure sensitivities, and the other two variables indicate or control the location and time constant impacts on yield. So by using the regression model, we looked at 36 years of data. These two heat maps show the yield sensitivities of rain-fed maize and soybeans to different hydrologic conditions as the atmospheric water demand on a y-axis and land water supply on a x-axis. And consistent to the conceptual yield responses to hydrologic imbalances for both crops, their exposure to hydrologic imbalances provided significantly negative effects on their yields for 36 years. And we also found that more than 50% of negative yield impacts over the past 36 years belong to those highlighted hydrologic conditions in the two heat maps. And we categorized those conditions into key hydroclimatic hazards here. First, the conditions highlighted on the top left corner of the heat maps as high demand with low supply, such as a drought. And then second, the conditions highlighted on the bottom right corner as low demand with high supply, such as waterlogging. And third, the condition highlighted just for maize, low demand with low supply, which is supposed to be a balanced condition, so we're considering covariance impacts as an explanation. So we defined empirically driven hydroclimatic hazard. So are they really considered a hazard, and can it really relate it to any economic loss? So the next figures show here the insurance payouts as a y-axis, over the exposure to different hydroclimatic hazards as x-axis. And we can learn that for both hydroclimatic hazard and crops, our empirically driven hydroclimatic hazards are statistically related to insurance payouts. The more exposure, the more insurance payout. Also, high demand with, sorry, could you go back? Yeah. And also for a high demand with low supply, such as a drought events, can happen over the full critical growing season and had a higher insurance payouts than the other hazards. So we learned that there are more exposure, the more exposure and the more economic loss. So how did the exposure to hydroclimatic hazards change over time and location? By using vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture threshold of crop-specific hydroclimatic hazards. Here we show the exposure trends in high demand with low supply in both rain-fed and irrigated counties. So for both crops, the rain-fed counties, which are no outlined areas in the figures, had a decreasing exposure trend, highly likely due to the intensified agricultural landscape and increasing precipitation trends over those areas in the past. And in general, the rain-fed areas are more vulnerable to hazard. But here, at least for 2 crops in the US, they had a benefit from reduced exposure. And noticeably for the irrigated counties, which are outlined areas in the figures, they had an increasing exposure trend, which means that there was a greatly increasing trends in irrigation water. And with the infrastructure change and system change, the irrigated areas were less vulnerable to hazard, as Nathan explained in the risk framework. But it's questionable that if we can continuously supply more water if the drought events happen more frequently. So for the conclusions, we found negative yield responses to hydrologic imbalances in both rain-fed maize and soybeans over 1981 to 2016. And the more exposure to hydroclimatic hazard, the more economic loss. And we found increasing trends in exposure to high water demand with low water supply in more irrigated counties. Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Kyung. So now we're going to turn it over to Eva, who's going to be talking about historical changes in snowmelt for irrigation.
Thanks, Nathan. So irrigation, of course, is incredibly important for crop production. And in many regions of the world, snowmelt is actually a key source of water for irrigation. Snowmelt is a really unique resource because snow accumulates during the winter as snowpack, and then in the spring, when temperatures warm, it melts and becomes available to crops. However, our climate is changing, and with that, we see changes in the amount of snow precipitation and also changes in the timing of snowmelt. And these changes may pose risks to crops. So in this project, we look at how snowmelt water supply and demand have changed in snow-dependent basins around the world. So how do we define snow dependent? Well, you can see in the map on the right of this slide, basins colored by their snow dependence, or as we define it, what % of the irrigation there is met by snowmelt, and also how much surface water is consumed by irrigation. So you can see in that map legend, the red rectangle, which represents our criteria for which basins are the most snow dependent. And overall, we had 32 basins that met that criteria, and those are the basins that we include in this study. So to model these historical changes to snowmelt irrigation, we compile data on crop irrigation demand using the global crop water model, as well as data on area equipped for irrigation. And from this, we get a time series of monthly data from 1985 to 2015. And in our analyses, we also factor in data on monthly domestic and industrial water demand to take into account the fact that not all surface water is going to go towards crop irrigation. On the supply side, we use snowmelt and rainfall runoff data from the Terra Climate data set. And that data is also monthly data for years 1985 to 2015, which allows us to link it up with the demand data. So to jump into our results, I'll first show some general trends of how demand and supply have changed between 1985 and 2015. So starting here with irrigation demand, here you can see in the red, orange, and yellow colors, basins where irrigation demand has increased, such as in a lot of the basins in Eurasia. And then on the other hand, the purple shaded areas represent basins where irrigation demand has decreased. I'll also note that the basins that have black outlines had p-values of less than 0.1. And that'll be true for all the maps that I show in this presentation. So to go over to the supply side, in the first map, we're looking at how the amount of snowmelt has changed through time, with the red areas representing basins where snowmelt is decreasing and the blue areas representing basins where snowmelt has increased. You can see that there's really a mix of trends here. And now to add on the timing of snowmelt, we can see areas where snowmelt is trending earlier in time, represented by those orange regions, or trending later in time, the blue regions. And you can see that all the basins that had significant changes to snowmelt with snowmelt timing were in Eurasia, and also were experiencing snowmelt earlier in the season. And in fact, in some of these areas, snowmelt is trending around 20 days earlier in 2015 than it was in 1985. So now I'm going to put this demand and supply data together to demonstrate to what extent crop demand is being met by snowmelt. And the key question here is really, how does snowmelt amount and timing line up with crop irrigation demand? And to best exemplify this, I'm focusing on one basin, Lake Zaysan, which is in Kazakhstan. So here I've just shown the monthly snowmelt patterns for 1985 and 2015. And you can see a peak of snowmelt in the spring, and you can also see a slight decline in the amount of snowmelt between these years. And now we can add on crop irrigation demand data. And now that we can see that not only is snowmelt supply declining in time, but irrigation demand is also increasing. But it's not only snowmelt that goes towards meeting irrigation demand. Rainfall is also an important surface water source. So I've added that here in red. And so now that we have all these trends, we can actually calculate how much of the irrigation demand is being met by snowmelt or rainfall. And then all the demand that isn't being met by those two sources is actually going to be met by alternative sources, such as stored excess surface water from previous seasons or interbasin transfers. And so I show those alternative sources in gray. And from this, we can calculate the percent of irrigation demand that is being met by snowmelt. And for example, in this basin in 1985, snowmelt met 25% of irrigation demands. But in 2015, it only met 20% of irrigation demands. So snowmelt consumed for irrigation is decreasing for this basin. And now we can actually look at the trends for all of our snow-dependent basins. And we can see that most of these basins are experiencing similar trends where they're experiencing decreases in irrigation demand met by snowmelt. It is represented by those red colors. When we pull all of this data together, we can get an average of all of our snow-dependent basins. And we can see that there is a significant overall decline in irrigation demand met by snowmelt between 1985 and 2015. We do find, however, that rainfall consumed for crop irrigation has slightly increased, perhaps reconciling some of those declines in snowmelt. But the need for alternative water sources is significantly increasing. So this research brings up a lot of further questions. such as how will snowmelt trends change in the future, which is actually a question addressed by a former postdoc in the lab whose study was published in Nature Climate Change. I'm also really interested in questions like whether there are certain farmer demographics that are more at risk to these shifts in irrigation supply, and how crop type distribution compares to areas of irrigation supply change. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Eva. So next up, we have Lena, who's going to share with us her work on trying to identify different pathways through which wildfire impacts agriculture.
Great, thank you, Nathan. So agriculture and fire share a long history. Across the world, humans have manipulated fire and altered fire regimes for different agricultural purposes. Enhanced fire activity occurs in agricultural settings when we think about fire being used to clear land for cultivation or grazing, and when crop residues and agricultural wastes are burned. We often think about the ways that agriculture uses fire in this way, but far less is known on the complex ways that fire, and recent large wildfires in particular, are impacting the agricultural sector. Globally, burned areas are trending down as land management practices are shifting alongside changing socioeconomic statuses. However, when we look at North America, we see a bit of a different trend. And so this graph shows annual burned area in the United States, Boreal North America, and Temperate North America. The Boreal and Temperate North America data comes from the 4th edition Global Fire Emissions Database and spans from 1997 to 2016. These data are a combination of remote sensed input databases like MODIS and a few others. And then when we look at the United States wildland numbers here for burned area, this comes from the National Interagency Coordination Center and shows federally burned wildland areas from 1983 to 2020. So we can see a bit of a longer picture trend with this United States burned area, and we can see this steady increase from this time scale. And so in the United States, a history of colonial land management focused more on fire suppression has coincided with the effects of anthropogenic climate change. And we're now seeing an increase in the frequency, size, and severity of large wildfires, alongside an increase in the cost of federal fire suppression efforts. Wildfires, like any natural hazard, can leave multifaceted and lasting impacts on agricultural landscapes. However, little is known on how wildfires today are impacting the agricultural sector. So to address this knowledge gap, we reviewed literature on wildfire agriculture interactions and created a conceptual model to highlight the multiple pathways through which wildfire can affect agriculture. This model shows that wildfire is a highly disruptive force on agriculture, and it recognizes these impacts and categorizes them into the pathways of direct, downwind, and downstream pathways of impact. And we find that these pathways influence agricultural resources, labor, and products. Looking at how wildfires can directly impact the agricultural landscape, we can look at the soil, and when wildfires make contact with the soil and burn soil, wildfire severity is often a key metric that influences chemical, physical, and biological soil properties by determining nutrient availability through mineralization or mobilization, through changing soil hydraulic properties and elevating rates of erosion, as well as through reducing microbial abundance, richness, evenness, and diversity after fire. Looking at crops and how they are directly impacted by wildfire, the 2020 USDA cause of loss data shows that the states of California, Washington, and Oregon saw the highest crop areas in the United States that were lost to fire. Now looking downwind, and how wildfire smoke is affecting farm workers. We see that smoke and high heat and their co-occurrence are negatively impacting farm workers, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where high levels of wildfire-driven particulate matter, 2.5, are often occurring on days when the heat index exceeds 29 degrees Celsius. And thinking about who the farm workers are in the United States, from the 2015 to 2016 National Agricultural Workers Survey, 75% of farm workers reported being born outside the US, 83% identified as Hispanic, and half of all farm workers reported being unauthorized to work in the United States, as well as having no health insurance. This trend of unequal vulnerability emerges again, and a quantitative analysis of community characteristics found that majority Black, Hispanic, and Native American census tracts were more vulnerable to wildfire. Thinking about livestock health, livestock are also negatively impacted by heat and smoke, similar to humans. And a recent Colorado study focused on dairy cows showed this negative trend, as increased PM 2.5 exposure resulted in inflammatory markers and decreases in milk yields. And for crops and how crops are being differentially impacted by downwind wildfire smoke, there is both the potential for some crops to experience increases in yields through increased diffuse fractions of photosynthetically active radiation and potential increases in light use efficiency, as well as the potential for decreased yields as we see more ozone and nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere following wildfire. And lastly, downstream, when we look at the downstream impacts that wildfires can have, we are seeing reductions in water quantity and quality. As wildfires burn vegetation, they decrease rates of transpiration and alter the soil's ability to intercept and store water. And for quality, we see that soil sediments, nutrients, and heavy metals are able to be transported in post-fire storms and pollute waterways, increase stream flows and floods, as well as cause physical damage to reservoirs and different irrigation infrastructure. So in conclusion, we kind of pulled apart these three main themes from our research, and we hope that our multiple pathways model, shown again here, can encourage future research on wildfire agriculture interactions that take into account the multidimensionality of wildfire and the need for transdisciplinary, culturally competent, and socially and environmentally just solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena. All right, last but not least, we have Avery talking about energy use and climate feedbacks from US irrigation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nathan. So I've been thinking about irrigation expansion as a potential climate change adaptation strategy. Irrigation, of course, reduces crop vulnerability to drought and heat stress, which shrinks this risk space that Nathan was talking about earlier. There are a lot of different studies that demonstrate the productivity benefits of irrigation. For example, Siebert and Dahl show that we would lose about 20% of global cereal production without irrigation, and losses were much higher for some other crops. There was a great paper by Rosa et al. That showed that sustainable expansion of irrigation could produce enough additional food for 1.4 billion people under a 3-degree warming scenario. And finally, irrigation also produces these local cooling effects that reduce the climate hazard in heavily irrigated regions. So in a number of different ways, irrigation is a promising strategy for adapting cropping systems to a warmer and more variable climate. But irrigation also comes with some potential costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation strategies that increase emissions have the potential to form reinforcing feedback loops that ultimately exacerbate climate change. So the goal of this project is to understand the net greenhouse gas impact of irrigation. We've identified 3 primary pathways through which irrigation affects emissions, which are all shown here. The first, which I'm going to focus on today, is an increase in energy use for both the extraction of groundwater and the application of water to fields through pressurized systems. The second pathway here involves changes in biogeochemical cycles in agricultural soils and vegetation. There aren't a lot of direct comparisons of emissions between irrigated and non-irrigated systems, so there's some uncertainty in the impacts here. but previous work has generally identified big increases in nitrous oxide emissions, small increases in soil carbon, and variable responses of methanogenesis and methanotrophy depending on the system. And despite this potential increase in soil carbon, we expect this pathway to increase emissions on net because of the large increases in nitrous oxide. The third pathway here, land sparing, is a potential benefit in terms of emissions. By increasing the productivity of currently cultivated lands, irrigation reduces demand for the conversion of intact ecosystems to agricultural production elsewhere. This concept follows from previous work that has found that agricultural intensification mitigates greenhouse gas emissions on the whole. So our goal is to quantify and map emissions impacts from each of these three pathways. Like I said, I'm going to focus on the energy use pathway today. The USDA Irrigation and Water Management Survey reports how much money farmers spend on fuel for irrigation pumps. And this data is broken down by fuel source or fuel type, and water source. Because we have information about how much money farmers are spending on fuels for irrigation pumping, we're able to couple those expenditures with fuel price data and emissions factors, including spatially variable emissions factors for electricity. And this gave us state level estimates of emissions from on-farm pumping. I just want to note that this only includes on-farm fuel use, and it doesn't account for any off-farm conveyance of water, including energy-intensive processes like interbasin transfers. So what we found is that fuel use for irrigation emitted 12.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in the US in 2018. And that number probably doesn't mean much to most of you, but it represents just under 2% of total US agricultural emissions. This map on the top right shows the state level distribution of irrigation emissions. And you can see a large portion of emissions come from Texas, Nebraska, and California. Total emissions were heavily dominated by groundwater irrigation, which accounted for 85% of emissions, and electricity was the dominant energy source. It contributed 70% of emissions. And this last detail is really promising from the perspective that continued decarbonization of the electrical grid will substantially reduce energy use emissions from irrigation without any additional interventions. This map on the bottom right shows the emissions per irrigated acre. And as you can see, emissions intensity is highest in the Southwest relative to the rest of the country. And this is because farmers in this hot, arid region rely more heavily on groundwater relative to surface water, tend to apply more water per irrigated acre, and use more pressurized rather than gravity-fed systems. As a nice counterpoint, the low emissions rate in California is associated with heavy reliance on electrical pumps and a relatively clean electric grid. So we wanted to get a higher resolution sense of where emissions were coming from. So we coupled our state level estimates of emissions rates with county scale data on water withdrawals for crop irrigation from the USGS to produce these county scale estimates of total emissions that are shown on the map. There are a number of emissions hotspots in places where you might expect them, like the Central Valley of California, along the Ogallala Aquifer region in the Great Plains, and in the lower Mississippi River Delta. So our overall goal for this project is to quantify irrigation-related climate feedbacks through these three pathways. So far, we found that the emissions associated with energy use are non-negligible. They account for almost 2% of US agricultural emissions. However, there is a clear path towards decarbonization for this component. Currently, we're in the process of quantifying the impacts from these other two pathways, biogenic emissions and land sparing. These appear to be critical components of the total emissions impact, and options for mitigation with respect to biogenic emissions in particular are much more limited. But moving towards a clear and integrated understanding of emissions from all three of these pathways will allow us to understand both the current impacts of irrigation on emissions, as well as potential climate change feedbacks that could stem from future scenarios of irrigation expansion. So that's all I've got. I'll hand it back to Nathan.
All right, thanks Avery. And that's it for us. Thanks again to the organizers. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And we also want to thank all of our amazing collaborators on these several studies. They're too numerous to mention. They take up the whole page, as well as our funders. So I think we still have a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you all so much. That was so interesting and such a cool sort of view of the impacts of climate change on agriculture from different scales and different aspects. I really enjoyed that. And I think we have a few folks that have left questions in the chat, but I'll also encourage anyone who wants to ask a question using video and voice to raise your hand, and then I can go ahead and call on you. So I think we'll start out with some questions from the chat. It looks like the first one was for Eva. It's from Dominique. And they say, apart from snow and rain, what are other sources of water for crops? Obviously, groundwater recharge depends on both snow and rain.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So groundwater is obviously can be a really important source of irrigation. But in our study, we actually focused just on surface water. So in our crop irrigation demand data, it actually differentiates surface water demand from groundwater demand. So we're specifically looking at surface water. So besides the snowmelt and rainfall runoff, big sources would be if there was any stored water from previous seasons or interbasin transfers. So getting water from nearby areas.
Great, thank you. And so there's a follow-up question, but I think we'll jump over, we'll switch folks back and forth for questions. So this is a question for Lena from Lynn. She asked, does agricultural fire change, increase or decrease during drought years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say definitely drought years have helped facilitate like larger wildfires by creating more fuel in terms of like drying out vegetation and helping to facilitate wildfires. So I think, yes, to answer that question kind of in that roundabout way.
Great, thank you. There's a follow-up comment that Dominique made saying impacts to crops from smoke are not just about yield. Quality of wine grapes is the subject of a research project in the Pacific Northwest. Grape juice was dumped due to smoke and bad taste. If you have anything to add on that comment, feel free. We can also switch, move on to the next comment. This is a question for Avery. Do you look at the source of electricity? For example, green in California, but not in Wyoming. Yeah, good question. So yes, we do have, that's captured by our emissions factors. So we're using state level emissions factors that are derived from the their EPA data based on the fuels that are used to generate electricity in each state. So that's a big reason why we see those lower rates of emissions in California, for example. Great, thank you. We have another question for Eva. Christina asked, was the decrease in snowmelt mostly due to decrease in overall snowpack, or were there changes in the ways the snowpack was lost, like increase in sublimation?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you. I would assume that our snowmelt data is pretty highly correlated with snowpack. Snowpack is a different metric within this data set. And but yeah, so I would assume that the decrease in snowmelt probably correlates as well with differences between snow precipitation and rainfall. But to answer your question, yes.
I'll follow up with a follow-up question for you from Phil Moat. He asked, he says, streamflow observations in the Columbia River Basin, as elsewhere in the West, show clear trends towards earlier snowmelt timing, e.g. Stewart et al. Wondering the source of your analysis and also whether you tried longer time periods than 1985 to 2015.
Yeah, so in terms of the source of our analysis, we're using data from the TerraClimate data set. And we do validate that with a couple of different data sets with pretty good results. But you're absolutely right that longer time periods may show different trends. And that's something that we're talking about, is adding on, the 7 years that have happened after 2015. There definitely might be different trends once we add in those years.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch over. We have a question for Kyung. So Yujan says, just wondering how multiple root zone soil moisture data will impact your analysis. For example, other than the root zone SM from GLDAS, there are also satellite-based root zone SM, for example, from SMOS SMAP.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the data I used from, the data I used for the analysis is from National Climate Assessment LDAS data. So it's part of a GLDAS data, but it's just only focusing on the North America and assimilated with the satellite data. And we looked at all three layers, 0 to 10 centimeter, and 10 to 40 centimeter, and 40 to 100 centimeter. But based on the cross-validation and sensitivity test, and considering the root growth of the crops over the growing season, we considered 0 to 10, 100 centimeter depth of the soil moisture. And for the other data sets, like SMOS and SMAP, compared to LDAS data, their data availabilities are shorter than LDAS. Like, for example, SMAP is only available since 2015, and SMOS, I think it is available like since 2009. And we wanted to look at the long-term climate yield sensitivities, so we chose the LDAS data with this satellite simulation.
Great, thank you. We have a question for Avery that asks, did you consider the possible effects of groundwater declines in any way on emissions? Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is we haven't yet, but we hope to. So groundwater decline, obviously, if you have to pump the water farther to get it to the farm, then you're going to use more emissions or more energy, sorry, which will result in more emissions. So far we've just been focused on quantifying what has actually, what the emissions actually are at this point, but we're hoping to do some scenario analysis that will look at things like, what if we move migrate irrigation or things like that. And part of that is going to be trying to regress our emissions by groundwater depth. Wonderful, thank you. So I think we have time for one last question. We have a question from William Costas. I think this might be for Eva, but feel free if anyone wants to jump in. It says significant groundwater loss in Asia and the Western US has been observed from ground observations and from space. Would there be a significant correlation between decreasing snowmelt sources and changes in rainfall / increased temperatures and changes in groundwater storage?
Yeah, thanks, William. I'm still kind of learning about hydrology, so I agree with your with your question. Maybe Nathan can chime in with that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The snowmelt runoff and rainfall, snowmelt and rainfall also are important for recharging groundwater in addition to providing surface water through runoff. So yes, totally agree, but here we're sort of looking at a slightly different question of specifically the snowmelt runoff and the rainfall runoff and how that impacts the surface water supplies for irrigation as opposed to the groundwater supplied irrigation. Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here, especially our speakers and all of the attendees for coming. We're really excited to continue on this series, and we hope to have another webinar either later this summer or early in the fall. I also want to say thank you to the rest of the GEC exec board for supporting this initiative for early career folks. And if you and your lab group would like to come and showcase some of your work in the future in our early career webinar series, feel free to reach out to us. And with that, I just want to say thanks again for everyone, to everyone for coming and for presenting. And we hope you have a lovely rest of your Friday.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you all.